The satellite feed flickered across 7 monitors in CENTCOM's operations center, each screen showing the same nightmare from different angles. 204 Navy SEALs pinned down in a valley that didn't exist on any official map, surrounded by an enemy force that had materialized like smoke, and 0 extraction options that didn't end with body bags. The officer coordinating the crisis had stopped sleeping 36 hours ago. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the radio, then stopped. There was nothing left to say. Every gunship was grounded by the sandstorm rolling across the desert like a living wall. Every medevac was weathered in. Every tactical option had been exhausted, war-gamed, and discarded. The enemy knew it too. The intercepted communications were almost cheerful. They had time. They had ammunition. They had the high ground and the weather and the simple mathematics of attrition. What they didn't have was any reason to expect what came next. 1,500 miles away, Captain Nadia Volkov was supposed to be on medical leave. The flight surgeon had grounded her after the last mission, the one that left her, Thunderbolt II, looking like it had gone through a metal shredder and somehow stayed airborne. Stress fractures in both hands from gripping the stick through a hydraulics failure. Concussion from the ejection seat she'd refused to pull. 3 rounds through the canopy that had missed her head by inches that measured in fractions. The paperwork said unfit for duty. Her logbook said different. She'd accumulated 4,000 hours in the Warthog, earned 2 distinguished flying crosses, and survived situations that existed in classified files most pilots would never see. But the younger officers in the squadron still smirked when she walked past, still whispered about the Russian name, the age on her file, the scars that mapped a career most of them couldn't imagine. They called her Baba Yaga behind her back, thinking it was clever. They didn't know she'd chosen that call sign herself 5 years ago, after a mission in Syria that still made generals uncomfortable in briefings. The base weather station showed impossible numbers, winds gusting past 50 knots, visibility measured in feet instead of miles, sand in the air thick enough to strip paint. The storm was supposed to last another 12 hours minimum. The SEALs had maybe 3. Volkov stood in the hangar staring at her A-10, its titanium bathtub fuselage still bearing scorch marks from the last impossible thing she'd survived. The crew chief was shaking his head before she even asked. But she wasn't asking. She was already walking toward the cockpit, her flight suit still smelling like the hospital antiseptic they'd used to clean the cuts on her face. The math was simple and terrible. 204 men were going to die unless someone did something that couldn't be done. The A-10 beside her was a machine designed to survive what killed everything else, to fly low where nothing else could, to bring hell when hell was the only option left. The storm outside sounded like freight trains colliding. Somewhere in the dark, an enemy force was tightening the noose, counting down the hours until dawn brought them slaughter and victory. They expected gunships that wouldn't come, medevac birds that couldn't fly, fast movers that needed visibility and altitude. They didn't expect a 43-year-old woman with stress fractures in her hands to start the engines on a plane held together with fury and titanium, to taxi into a sandstorm that had grounded everything with wings, to disappear into weather that weather officers called unsurvivable. The crew chief watched her pre-flight checks with something between awe and horror. He'd seen her land with 1 engine, half a tail, and hydraulic fluid painting the runway. He'd seen her bring back aircraft that should have been tombstones, but this wasn't battle damage. This was volunteering for a death sentence. "Captain, the winds aloft are showing," he started. She cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. Her hands moved across the switches and panels with the muscle memory of 4,000 hours, each movement precise despite the medical tape wrapped around her knuckles. The Thunderbolt's twin General Electric turbofans spooled up with their distinctive whine, a sound that made infantrymen cheer and enemy combatants run. But here in this hangar with the wind screaming outside like a living thing, it sounded like a death march. The crew chief stepped back from the aircraft, his face pale in the harsh fluorescent light. He'd write the report later, the one that documented how he'd tried to stop her, how he'd explained that the weather minimums weren't suggestions but survival requirements, how she'd ignored every regulation designed to keep pilots alive. He'd write it, but he wouldn't file it. Not after he heard what happened next. Volkov taxied into darkness that swallowed the A-10's lights like they'd never existed. The tower frequency was silent. No clearance, no authority, no permission. Just a woman and a machine designed for violence heading into a storm that was grounding B-52s and keeping F-22s safely tied down. 1,500 miles away, the SEAL team leader watched his perimeter collapse by inches. His name was Commander Marcus Webb, and he'd survived 3 deployments that would have broken most men. But this wasn't survival. This was mathematics. 37 minutes since the last radio contact with anyone who could help. 18 casualties who needed medevac. Ammunition running low enough that he was calculating rounds per man instead of rounds per magazine. The enemy had patience. They had the high ground. They had forward observers calling adjustments to mortar fire that was walking closer with each salvo. Webb had sent the final situation report 40 minutes ago, the one that used words like untenable and catastrophic, and buried in the military jargon was the truth they all knew. They were going to die here. Not all at once. Not cleanly. The enemy would wait for dawn, then come with overwhelming force, and the SEALs would sell their lives expensively but futilely. The junior officer beside him was still calling for air support, his voice cracking slightly on the radio, still hopping, still believing in the system. Webb had stopped believing an hour ago. He was cycling through the names of his men, memorizing them, preparing for the letters he'd never get to write. The sandstorm hit Volkov's A-10 like a physical wall. The aircraft shuddered, dropped, caught itself. She felt it in her teeth, in the stress fractures that sent white lightning up her arms. The heads-up display was useless, the instruments showing numbers that didn't matter because no instruments could capture this kind of chaos. She was flying on instinct and madness, keeping the warthog's nose pointed approximately toward a valley she'd memorized from satellite photos that might as well have been ancient history. The GPS was drifting. The radar altimeter was screaming warnings. The fuel gauge was dropping faster than flight plans accounted for because she was fighting the wind with throttle, burning JP-8 like it was going out of style, just to maintain something resembling controlled flight. This was beyond tactics. Beyond training. This was the place where skill became irrelevant and only will mattered. Her hands on the stick were steady despite the pain. Her breathing was controlled. She'd done impossible things before. She'd just never done them blind. The radio crackled with static and ghost signals, fragments of transmissions from aircraft that were safely on the ground. She ignored them all. Somewhere ahead, 204 men were dying by degrees. Somewhere ahead was a valley that hostile forces thought was theirs. They were about to learn different. She dropped through 10,000 feet, then 8,000, descending into air so thick with sand it was like flying through concrete. The A-10 bucked and protested, its titanium skin taking punishment that would have torn lighter aircraft apart. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon in the nose carried 1,100 rounds of 30mm hate. The wings held Mavericks and Hydra rockets and enough ordnance to level a city block. But none of it mattered if she couldn't find the target, couldn't see the enemy, couldn't tell friend from foe in a sandstorm that turned the world into uniform blindness. 6,000 feet. The terrain warning system was having a nervous breakdown. 4,000 feet. She should be dead already. The winds at this altitude were doing things that aeronautical engineers said were impossible, creating microbursts and shear that could flip an aircraft like a toy. She rode them like a surfer riding avalanches, making corrections so fast they were instinctive, keeping the Warthog in something resembling level flight through pure obstinacy. 3,000 feet. The altimeter was unreliable. The ground could be anywhere. She was navigating by dead reckoning and prayer, trusting instruments that were lying and instincts that had kept her alive this long. 2,000 feet. She should pull up, should abort, should acknowledge that some things couldn't be done. Instead, she descended further into the storm, into the dark, into the place where 204 men were counting their final ammunition and making peace with gods they'd neglected. Commander Webb heard it before he saw it. A sound that didn't belong in the sandstorm, a roar that was distinct even through the chaos of wind and sand. His head snapped up. Impossible. Nothing was flying, nothing could fly. The sound grew louder, a twin-engine scream that every infantryman knew in their bones. Someone beside him whispered warthog like a prayer, but it couldn't be. The storm had visibility measured in yards. The winds were beyond anything flight-worthy. And yet the sound was unmistakable, growing closer, coming from a direction that suggested the pilot was flying nap of the earth in conditions where instruments were useless and death was the default outcome. Webb grabbed his radio. Any station, this is Dagger 1. If that's one of ours, we are marking position with IR strobes. Enemy is north and east of our position, dug in on the ridgeline. Friendlies are in the valley floor, how copy? Static answered him. Then, cutting through the interference like a knife, Dagger 1, Baba Yaga, I have your strobes. Gonna need you to keep your heads down. This is going to get loud. The voice was female, calm, and carried an accent that Webb couldn't place. Russian maybe, but right now she could have been speaking Martian for all he cared. She was here. Someone was here. The impossible had just happened. Volkov's targeting pod was next to useless in the sandstorm, but the infrared strobes the SEALs were using burned through the chaos like beacons. She could see them now, clustered in a depression that provided minimal cover, surrounded by heat signatures on the ridgeline that could only be enemy combatants. The tactical picture assembled itself in her mind with the clarity of long experience. Mortars on the high ground, machine gun positions covering the approaches, maybe 200 enemy fighters against 204 SEALs who were running out of everything except courage. Her first gun run would have to be perfect because she wouldn't get a second chance. Not in this weather. Not with fuel burning away and the A-10 taking damage from sand that was scouring the titanium skin like industrial sandpaper. She rolled in from the south, descending through air that fought her every inch, keeping the nose pointed at the ridgeline by feel more than sight. The GAU-8 cannon was already spooled up, 3,000 rounds per minute of depleted uranium waiting to introduce the concept of close air support to an enemy that thought they were safe. The gun run lasted 3 seconds. To the SEALs in the valley, it sounded like the hand of God tearing the sky in half. The distinctive BRRRT of the GAU-8 was audible even through the sandstorm, a sound so deep it was felt in the chest rather than heard. On the ridgeline, 30mm rounds chewed through fighting positions and heavy weapons, and anyone unlucky enough to be standing where Volkov had aimed. The A-10 pulled up hard, banking away from terrain she couldn't see, and she felt the stress fractures in her hands crack wider with the G-forces. Blood seeped through the medical tape. She ignored it. That was one gun run. The enemy was still up there, still dangerous, still capable of killing everyone in the valley if they regrouped. She came around for another pass, this time from the east, using the slight variation in the sandstorm's density to mask her approach. The Mavericks left the wings with solid thumps she felt through the airframe. Guided by infrared and fury, they found the mortar positions and turned them into craters and debris. Secondary explosions lit up her targeting pod as ammunition cooked off. Commander Webb watched the ridgeline die. That was the only word for it. Die. The positions that had been raining death on his men for hours were being systematically erased by a pilot he couldn't see, flying in conditions that shouldn't allow for precision strikes, hitting targets with an accuracy that suggested either perfect instruments or perfect instinct. His radio operator was staring at the sky with an expression that bordered on religious. "Sir, she's making gun runs in zero visibility." "How is that possible?" Webb didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. He just knew that for the first time in 6 hours the incoming fire had stopped. The enemy was dying instead of his men. And somewhere above them, invisible in the sandstorm, a pilot called Baba Yaga was rewriting the rules about what could be done. Volkov's fuel gauge was screaming at her. She'd burned through 20% of her combat load just fighting the weather. Her hands were leaving blood on the stick. The A-10 was taking damage from the sand, from the turbulence, from flight conditions that were degrading the aircraft with every second. But the infrared showed enemy combatants breaking, running, abandoning their positions in the face of an attack they couldn't counter or escape. She made 3 more gun runs, methodically working her way along the ridgeline, turning prepared positions into graves. The GAU-8's ammunition counter was dropping toward empty. She was calculating the mathematics of violence, balancing the rounds remaining against the targets that still showed heat signatures on the targeting pod. The A-10 shuddered through another violent burst of turbulence, and for a moment she thought she'd lost it, thought the winds had finally exceeded what even a warthog could handle. The aircraft dropped 300 feet in 2 seconds. She fought it back to level flight, her hands screaming protest, and came around for what she knew had to be the final pass. 500 rounds left in the cannon, fuel at 30% and burning fast. The storm wasn't weakening. If anything, it was getting worse. She lined up on the remaining enemy positions and let the GAU-8 speak its final piece. The ridgeline erupted in dust and sand and bodies. When she pulled up this time, the infrared showed no more heat signatures. No more threats. Just 204 Americans who were still breathing because she'd done something that everyone said couldn't be done. Dagger 1 Baba Yaga. Ridgeline is clear. You've got maybe an hour before they regroup. Use it. Her voice was steady despite the pain in her hands, despite the fuel situation, despite the aircraft that was holding together through will and titanium. Commander Webb's response came back immediate. Baba Yaga Dagger 1 requesting immediate medevac for 18 urgent casualties. We have 2 KIA. Can you coordinate? There was a pause on the radio. A long pause that Webb felt in his gut. Then Dagger 1 negative. No medevac birds are flying. I'm RTB now, fuel critical. The storm is supposed to break in 90 minutes. Hold until then. Help is coming. How copy? The finality in her voice was like a door closing. She'd done everything she could. She'd saved 204 men from being overrun. But she couldn't save the wounded, couldn't coordinate evacuations, couldn't do anything except try to get herself home through a sandstorm that was actively trying to kill her. Webb acknowledged the transmission and watched the sky where the A-10 had been. Gone now, swallowed by sand and darkness, leaving them alone again, but alive, still alive. Volkov pointed the A-10's nose toward home and started climbing, trying to get above the worst of the storm. The aircraft was protesting every input, the controls mushy from sand in the hydraulics, the engines showing temperatures that made her nervous. Fuel at 25%. She needed 20% to make it back. That left 5% margin. 5% between landing and walking. The numbers didn't care about heroics. The numbers were just numbers, and they were saying she'd pushed too hard, stayed too long, spent too much on violence and not enough on survival. The headwind was brutal. The GPS was still drifting. She was navigating by compass and hope, heading approximately toward the base that might as well have been on another planet. 10,000 feet. The turbulence was marginally better. The fuel gauge was dropping with mechanical precision. 23%. 21. The engines were still running, but she could hear the strain in them, the slight roughness that said sand was abrading components that were precision machined for tolerance measured in microns. 19%. She checked her position against dead reckoning, still 300 miles from base. The math wasn't working. She'd burned too much fuel fighting the storm, making gun runs, keeping the A-10 in the air when physics said it should have fallen. 17%. The decision point arrived with mathematical certainty. She could try to make it home and run out of fuel somewhere over empty desert, or she could eject now, while she had altitude and options, and let the A-10 die without taking her with it. The ejection seat was right there. The handles were within reach. 3,000 pounds of rocket motor that would punch her clear of the aircraft and into a parachute that might survive the winds. Might. The A-10 was just a machine. A collection of titanium and systems that could be replaced. She was a pilot with 4,000 hours of experience that couldn't. The logical decision was obvious. She reached for the ejection handles. Her fingers brushed the yellow and black stripping. Then she pulled her hand back and put it on the throttle instead. The Warthog had brought her through worse, had taken battle damage that should have been fatal and kept flying, had survived when everything else failed. She wasn't abandoning it to fall into empty desert because she was scared of mathematics. 15% fuel. She pushed the throttles forward slightly, trading fuel for time, trying to outrun the headwind that was eating her margin. The base was 250 miles away. The numbers said she wouldn't make it. But numbers didn't account for the way she could feel the aircraft responding, could sense the tiny adjustments that maximized efficiency, could fly the A-10 like an extension of her own body, because she'd done it for so long the boundary between pilot and machine had blurred. The crew chief was watching the radar when the impossible blip appeared on the scope. The tower had given up on her an hour ago. Weather recon showed the storm was still unsurvivable. The emergency rescue teams were on standby, but for what? You can't rescue someone from a sandstorm that extends for 300 miles. You can only wait for the wreckage and hope the flight recorder survived. But there it was. A single radar return, moving at the right speed at the right altitude, coming from the right direction. The tower controller's hand was shaking as he keyed the microphone. Baba Yaga, tower, safe fuel state. The response came back through static so thick it was barely intelligible. Tower Baba Yaga, fuel at 7%, requesting straighten approach, emergency declared. 7%. The tower controller did the math instinctively. 7% in an A-10 was maybe 20 minutes of flight time. Maybe. She was still 40 miles out. The controller looked at the weather display. Winds gusting to 60 knots. Visibility a quarter mile. Crosswinds that would make landing a Cessna dangerous, let alone a combat aircraft being held together by determination and titanium. He should tell her to eject, should order her to abandon the aircraft. But something in her voice stopped him. She hadn't flown through the impossible just to quit at the finish line. The approach was everything wrong with aviation condensed into 5 minutes of controlled violence. Volkov fought crosswinds that tried to throw the A-10 off the center line, descended through turbulence that bounced the aircraft like a toy, watched the fuel gauge touch 5%, then 4%. The runway lights were barely visible through the sand. The aircraft was responding sluggishly, damaged and exhausted and ready to quit. She wasn't. 3% fuel. She could see the runway now, a strip of lights in the chaos. The winds were trying to push her past it. She crabbed the A-10 into the crosswind, wings not level, nose pointed 20 degrees off runway heading, flying the aircraft in a controlled skid that looked like a crash waiting to happen. 2%. The wheels touched concrete. The A-10 bounced, settled, and she deployed the thrust reversers and stood on the brakes. The aircraft decelerated with the sound of metal screaming. 1% fuel. She taxied clear of the runway, following the marshaller's directions to the parking area where emergency crews waited with foam trucks and ambulances. 0%. The engines wound down with a dying whine. She sat in the cockpit, hands still on the stick, and allowed herself one deep breath. She'd done it. Done the thing that couldn't be done. Saved 204 men. Brought the aircraft home. Survived. The crew chief was there when she climbed down from the cockpit, his face a mixture of awe and anger. "Captain, you can't, you shouldn't," he stopped when he saw her hands. The blood had soaked through the medical tape, left dark stains on the flight stick. The flight surgeon appeared beside him, already reaching for Volkov's hands with professional concern. She pulled away. "The SEALs." The crew chief understood what she was asking. "Safe. Enemy broke contact. Medevac birds are inbound now that the storm is clearing." All because he couldn't finish the sentence. What she'd done didn't have words, not in any language. The base commander arrived 15 minutes later, his uniform crisp despite the hour, his face unreadable. Volkov stood at attention, her hands wrapped in fresh bandages, waiting for the reprimand she knew was coming. Unauthorized flight, violated weather minimums, risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft, ignored medical grounding. The charges practically wrote themselves. The commander looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Captain Volkov, I need your report on the mission." Not a reprimand, a request for her report. She gave it standing up, reciting the facts with military precision, leaving out the parts where she thought she was going to die. The story should have ended there, should have been classified, buried, forgotten. Another incident in a war full of incidents. But Commander Webb had other ideas. He'd filed his own report, one that used words like extraordinary and heroic and beyond the call of duty. He'd made sure every one of his 204 SEALs knew who had saved them, knew the call sign, knew that a pilot they'd never met had risked everything when everyone else had given up. The younger officers in Volkov's squadron heard about it third hand, filtered through military channels and embellished with each retelling. But the core facts remained unchanged. She'd flown through the impossible and won. The smirk stopped. The whispers about her age and her name and her scars changed tone. When she walked into the briefing room now, junior pilots stood a little straighter. The call sign Baba Yaga stopped being mockery and became something else. Respect, fear, recognition. She was still 43 years old, still had stress fractures that the flight surgeon said would take months to heal properly, still carried scars that mapped a career most pilots would never approach. But now when people heard her call sign, they knew what it meant. Not the witch from Russian folklore. The thing that came when death was certain and hope was dead. The thing that arrived when everything else had failed. The thing that saved you when salvation was impossible. 3 weeks later, Volkov was in the hangar when a young lieutenant approached her. Fresh out of flight school, still had that new uniform smell, hadn't yet learned that confidence and competence weren't the same thing. He'd been assigned to the squadron 2 days ago, full of fighter pilot swagger and tactical knowledge that came from simulators instead of survival. "Captain," he said, his tone respectful but carrying that edge of youth that thought it knew everything. "I heard about the SEAL extraction. Impressive flying. But I was looking at the weather data, and I'm not sure how you managed the approach in those crosswinds. Could you walk me through your technique?" Volkov looked at him. Really looked at him. Saw herself 20 years ago, before the scars, before the missions that didn't make it into official reports, before she learned that technique was what got you through Tuesday, but instinct was what got you through Thursday when Thursday was trying to kill you. She could give him the answer he wanted. Talk about crab angles and crosswind corrections and power management. Reduce what she'd done to a series of technical steps that he could memorize and think he understood. But that would be a lie. What she'd done couldn't be taught. It could only be survived. "Lieutenant," she said finally, "you want to know the technique. The technique is simple. You point the nose where you want to go and you don't quit until you get there or you're dead. Everything else is just details." The young lieutenant nodded like he understood, but his eyes said he didn't. Not yet. Maybe he would someday, after his first real mission, after the first time the mathematics of fuel and distance and enemy fire didn't add up to survival. Or maybe he'd wash out before then, go fly cargo or tankers or something safe where technique mattered more than will. Volkov didn't know which future waited for him. She just knew that the pilots who lasted weren't the ones with the best test scores or the fastest reaction times. They were the ones who could look at impossible situations and decide to proceed anyway, who could feel their hands braking and keep flying, who could watch the fuel gauge hit zero and trust the aircraft to find one more mile. The A-10 that had carried her through the sandstorm was in deep maintenance now, undergoing repairs that the crew chief said would take weeks. Sand in every system. Stress fractures in the airframe. Turbine blades scored and pitted. The aircraft had given everything it had, flown past its limits and survived, just like her. She visited it sometimes, running her bandaged hands along the titanium skin that bore new scars to match her old ones. The crew chief had stopped trying to shoo her away from the maintenance area. He understood. Pilot and aircraft. You didn't separate them just because the mission was over. The medal ceremony happened without fanfare, buried in the daily routine of military life. The Distinguished Flying Cross joined the two she already had, a piece of ribbon and metal that represented what couldn't be spoken. The citation was carefully worded, classified details removed, reduced to the bare minimum. Extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, performed in conditions of extreme danger, resulted in saving friendly forces. It didn't mention the 204 SEALs. Didn't mention the fuel state or the broken hands or the flight that everyone said couldn't happen. Just the facts, stripped of context, filed away. But the men who'd been in that valley knew. They'd seen the ridgeline die. They'd heard the BRRRT of the GAU-8 cutting through the sandstorm. They'd gone home to their families instead of being buried in unmarked graves because a 43-year-old woman had decided that mathematics didn't matter as much as will. Commander Webb tracked her down after the ceremony, found her in the squadron ready room studying mission reports for the next deployment. He stood in the doorway for a moment, this man who'd survived 3 tours and thought he'd seen everything, trying to find words adequate to the moment. "Captain Volkov," he said finally, "my men wanted you to have this." He handed her a small wooden plaque, hand-carved, obviously made by someone with more sincerity than skill. The plaque read, "Baba Yaga, when death is certain, she comes anyway, Dagger Team." Below that, 204 signatures, cramped and overlapping, every SEAL who'd been in that valley signing their names. Some of the signatures were shaky, written by men still recovering from their wounds. Some were firm and bold. All of them were there. Volkov took the plaque with her bandaged hands, feeling the weight of it, the grain of the wood, the permanence of ink on carved letters. She'd received medals and commendations and official recognition that would go in her file, but this meant more. This was 204 men saying, "We saw what you did, we know what it cost, and we won't forget. Tell them." She started, then stopped. What could she tell them? That she was just doing her job, that would diminish what they'd endured, that it was extraordinary, that would make it about her instead of them. "Tell them the A-10 did the work," she said finally. "I just pointed it in the right direction." Webb smiled slightly. "I'll tell them that, but we both know better." He left her alone with the plaque and her thoughts. She set it on her desk, among the flight manuals and tactical reports and all the ordinary debris of military aviation. It looked out of place there, this hand-carved piece of sentiment in a world of precision and protocol. The next deployment came 3 months later. Volkov's hands had healed enough to pass the flight physical, though the flight surgeon had given her a look that said he knew she was minimizing the pain. The squadron deployed to a different desert, a different war, a different set of impossible situations that needed someone to fly into them and survive. She was still 43, still carried scars, still flew an aircraft that the Air Force kept trying to retire and Congress kept funding. But something had changed. When the mission briefs came down, when the weather was bad and the enemy was entrenched and the ground forces needed close air support in conditions that made other pilots shake their heads, the mission commanders looked to her first. Not because of her rank, not because of regulations, but because when death was certain and hope was gone, they knew who to call. The call sign Baba Yaga became something the enemy heard whispered in their own communications, the witch who flew through storms. The demon in the A-10. The thing that arrived when they thought they were safe. Psychological operations officers monitored the chatter, heard the fear in voices when they talked about the pilot who couldn't be killed, couldn't be stopped, couldn't be deterred by weather or fire or mathematics. They tried to figure out how to weaponize it, how to turn one pilot's reputation into a tactical advantage. But you can't manufacture legend. You can only survive long enough to become one. Years passed. The wars changed theaters and names, but not nature. Men still got pinned down. Aircraft still got damaged. Missions still required someone to do the impossible. And when those moments came, when the radio crackled with desperate calls and the weather was unsurvivable and the tactical situation was untenable, Volkov was there. Flying the same A-10, older now, more hours on the airframe, but still capable of violence and survival in equal measure. She trained the new pilots, the ones who came to the squadron fresh from flight school with their theories and their confidence. She didn't tell them about the sandstorm mission. Didn't need to. They'd heard about it already, the story growing with each retelling until it was more myth than memory. She just taught them how to fly the Warthog, how to trust the titanium bathtub, how to make gun runs when the ground fire was so thick it looked like fireworks. Some of them learned. Some of them washed out. The ones who stayed understood that technique would get you most of the way there, but the last distance had to be covered with something else. Something that couldn't be taught or measured or put in flight manuals. Will. Refusal. The decision to proceed when every rational calculation said to quit. The plaque from Dagger Team stayed on her desk through every deployment, every base transfer, every change of command. 204 signatures, fatting slightly now, the wood worn smooth from her hands running over it during long nights planning missions. It reminded her why she'd chosen this life, why she kept flying when her body said to quit, why she pushed past the limits that kept other pilots safe and alive. Not for glory, not for medals. For the men on the ground who needed someone to come when coming was impossible. The Air Force tried to promote her, wanted to make her a major, then a lieutenant colonel, get her into staff positions where her experience could train the next generation. She declined each time, citing the same reason. She was a pilot, not an administrator. What she didn't say was that she needed to fly the way other people needed to breathe. That the cockpit of an A-10 was the only place she felt completely herself. That after everything she'd survived, desk work would kill her faster than enemy fire. They let her stay, partly because her record spoke for itself, partly because when the truly impossible missions came down, they knew exactly who to call. She became an institution. The pilot who'd been flying Warthogs since before some of her squadron mates were born, who had more combat hours than entire units combined, who'd survived things that ended other careers and kept flying anyway. The final mission came on a Tuesday, not special, not marked, just another tasking in a war that had lasted so long most people had stopped paying attention. Friendly forces pinned down, enemy reinforcements inbound, weather degrading, close air support requested. Volkov was 51 years old now. Her hands still ached where the stress fractures had been. She had scars on scars, a map of survival written in scar tissue and healed wounds. The A-10 she flew was the same one from the Sandstorm mission, patched and repaired and flown so many times that maintenance crews joked it was held together with speed tape and prayers. The mission brief was straightforward: provide close air support for a Marine unit that had been ambushed during a routine patrol. Standard stuff. Except the weather was turning bad. Except the enemy had brought anti-aircraft systems. Except the math was starting to look familiar. Volkov listened to the brief with the attention of long experience, noting the details that mattered: friendly positions, enemy strength, available ordnance, weather minimums. The mission commander was young, hadn't been born when she'd first climbed into an A-10. He looked at her with something between respect and concern. "Captain, if you think the weather is too risky," she cut him off with a look. After everything she'd survived, after all the missions that shouldn't have worked, he thought she'd decline because of weather. She took the mission. Of course she took the mission. The flight to the target area was routine: clear skies, light winds. Though responding like it always did, that familiar feeling of the aircraft becoming an extension of her intent. The Warthog wasn't graceful, wasn't fast, but it was honest. It told you exactly what it was doing, exactly what it could handle, and if you listened, it would keep you alive. She'd been listening for 51 years. The Marines on the ground sounded calm on the radio, but Volkov had been doing this long enough to hear what wasn't being said. They were in trouble, real trouble. The kind where calm voices meant they'd already accepted they might not walk away. She descended toward the fight, scanning the ground through her targeting pod, identifying friendly positions by their IR strobes, enemy positions by the muzzle flashes and heat signatures. The tactical picture assembled itself: Marines in a wadi, surrounded on three sides, taking fire from entrenched positions, and there further back the anti-aircraft systems that made this complicated. ZSU-23-4 Shilka, radar-guided, capable of throwing up a wall of lead that could shred an aircraft. The smart play was to take out the anti-aircraft first. The safe play. But the Marines didn't have time for safe plays. She rolled in on the enemy infantry positions instead, the GAU-8 already spinning up. The gun run was textbook. 3 seconds of BRRRT that tore through enemy positions and sent survivors running. She pulled up, banking away from the Shilka's engagement envelope, and came around for another pass. The Marines were using the breathing room to reposition, pulling their wounded to better cover. But the Shilka was still out there, still dangerous, still capable of turning her A-10 into scrap metal if the operator was good and the luck was bad. She'd fought anti-aircraft before. Had the scars to prove it. The trick was to be unpredictable, vary the approach angle, never give them a clean solution. She came in from the north this time, lower and faster, and put a Maverick into the enemy's command post. The explosion was visible even through the targeting pod, secondary detonations suggesting she'd hit something important. The Shilka opened up. She felt the impacts before she heard them, the A-10 shuddering as 23 rounds walked up the fuselage. The master caution light illuminated, then the hydraulic warning, then the fire warning in the right engine. The aircraft was dying around her, systems failing in sequence, but she was still flying, still had control, still had the left engine and the titanium bathtub that made the A-10 legendary. She shut down the right engine, activated the fire suppression, and assessed the damage. Hydraulics at 50%. Flight controls sluggish but responsive. She could make it back. Probably. The Marines were still on the ground, still taking fire. The mission wasn't done. She made 2 more gun runs with a dying aircraft, methodically eliminating enemy positions, while the A-10 leaked hydraulic fluid, and the remaining systems threw warnings that cascaded across her display. The Marines broke contact, using the covering fire to withdraw to a defensible position. Mission accomplished. Now she just had to get home. The flight back was a negotiation between what the aircraft could do and what physics demanded. She climbed slowly, carefully, feeling the controls get mushier as the hydraulic pressure dropped. The base was 90 miles away. The A-10 was falling apart beneath her, but it was still flying, still responding, still bringing her home. At 40 miles out, she declared an emergency. The tower controller's voice was professional, but she could hear the concern. Baba Yaga Tower, understand you are declaring emergency. Say nature of emergency. Where to start? Engine fire. Hydraulic failure. Battle damage to the airframe. She gave them the short version. Tower Baba Yaga, I've got battle damage and degraded flight controls. Requesting straighten approach and emergency equipment standing by. The controller rogered, and she could picture the scene on the ground. Fire trucks rolling, ambulances positioning, the crash recovery team prepping. All the machinery of emergency response activating because she'd done what she always did, flown into danger and survived. The landing was delicate. The A-10 wanted to drift, the damaged flight controls making every input a guess. She compensated with power, using the left engine to keep the aircraft balanced, descending toward a runway that looked very small and very far away. The wheels touched. The aircraft bounced, settled, and she deployed the thrust reverser on the left engine. The A-10 slewed slightly, then straightened, and rolled to a stop with emergency vehicles converging from all directions. She shut down the remaining engine and sat in the cockpit while foam trucks sprayed the right side of the aircraft, while firefighters swarmed around checking for hot spots, while the crew chief climbed up to the canopy with an expression she recognized, relief mixed with exasperation. Captain, one of these days you're going to bring back an aircraft that doesn't need a month of repairs. She smiled despite the adrenaline still singing in her veins. Not today, though. The battle damage assessment took 3 hours. 23 impacts from 23 cannon fire. Hydraulic lines severed. Right engine destroyed. Sections of the tail stabilizer missing. The aircraft should have crashed. Any other aircraft would have crashed. But the A-10 was designed to take punishment and keep flying, and she'd used every inch of that capability to get home. The crew chief walked around the damaged Warthog, shaking his head. This one's going to take some work, Captain. Might be down for a while. She nodded. There were other A-10s. Other missions. The war didn't stop because one aircraft needed repairs. But this aircraft was special. This was the Warthog that had flown through the sandstorm. That had saved 204 SEALs when salvation was impossible. That had taken her through 20 years of missions and brought her home every time. The crew chief saw her looking at the battle damage and understood. We'll fix her, ma'am. She's been through worse. Had it, though. Volkov looked at the 23 holes punched through the titanium skin, the destroyed engine, the hydraulic fluid still dripping onto the tarmac. This was bad, but the crew chief was right. The aircraft had survived worse. They both had. The medical check was routine. Minor whiplash from the hard landing, bruising from the harness, nothing serious. The flight surgeon cleared her for duty with the same look he always gave her, the one that said he knew she was tougher than she should be and flying longer than she should fly. She ignored it. She'd been ignoring that look for 20 years. The debrief happened in the squadron briefing room, mission commander and intelligence officers going through every detail of the engagement. She gave them the facts: enemy positions, ordnance expended, battle damage received. Kept it clinical, professional. Didn't mention the moment when the Shilka opened up and she thought this might be the one that finally got her. Didn't mention flying a crippled aircraft 90 miles because the alternative was ejecting over hostile territory. Just the facts. The Marines she'd supported sent a message through channels, formal, grateful. All 19 of them had made it back because she provided covering fire with an aircraft that was actively failing. The message thanked her for her professionalism and dedication. Military language that meant, "You saved our lives." She filed it with the other messages, the other thank yous, the accumulated gratitude of people who'd survived because she'd been there when they needed her. The collection was getting large, too large. It made her uncomfortable sometimes, seeing it all together, the weight of all those lives that had depended on her decisions. But she kept the messages anyway. They were proof, not of her skill, though that was there, not of her courage, though she demonstrated plenty. Proof that the impossible could be done if you refused to accept that it was impossible, that mathematics could be argued with, that death could be negotiated with, that one pilot in one aircraft could change outcomes that seemed predetermined. The young pilots in the squadron heard about the mission, about the battle damage, about bringing home an aircraft that by all rights should have crashed. They looked at her differently now. Not just respect, something closer to awe. She was becoming what she'd never intended to be, a legend. The pilot who couldn't be killed. The woman who'd been flying warthogs since they were new. The call sign that enemy forces whispered about in the dark. She didn't feel legendary. She felt 51 years old, with scars that ached in cold weather and memories of friends who hadn't made it home. She felt tired sometimes, the kind of tired that came from 20 years of adrenaline and violence and pushing past limits that were supposed to be absolute. But when the mission briefs came down, when friendly forces needed support and the weather was bad and the enemy was dug in, she still took the missions, still climbed into the cockpit, still pointed the A-10 toward danger and trusted it to bring her home, because that's what she did. That's what she'd always done. The A-10 took 6 weeks to repair. 6 weeks of the crew chief and his team rebuilding systems, replacing the destroyed engine, patching holes, restoring the aircraft to flight status. Volkov visited the hangar daily, watching the progress, running her hands along the titanium skin that bore new scars to match the old ones. The crew chief tolerated her presence. He'd long since given up trying to keep pilots away from their aircraft during maintenance, especially this pilot, especially this aircraft. There was a bond there that went beyond mechanics and aerodynamics. Pilot and machine had survived together, fought together, bled together. You didn't separate that just because the mission was over. When the A-10 returned to flight status, Volkov was the one who took it up for the test flight. Standard procedure would have been to let a test pilot handle it, someone who specialized in evaluating repaired aircraft. But the squadron commander had looked at her request and signed off without comment. Some things didn't need to be said. The test flight was perfect. The A-10 responded exactly as it should, all systems nominal, the new engine purring with the same reliable tone as the original. She put it through its paces, rolls, climbs, dives, high-G turns that stressed the airframe and proved the repairs were solid. The aircraft passed everything. Of course it did. The crew chief didn't do mediocre work. When she landed and shut down, the crew chief was waiting with a clipboard full of test data and a smile that said he already knew everything had checked out. "She's good as new, Captain. Better, actually. We upgraded some systems while we had her apart." Volkov nodded, but they both knew the truth. The aircraft wasn't new. It was old, worn, scarred. But it was hers, and it would fly until it couldn't anymore, and she'd be there with it every mile of the way. The deployments continued. More deserts, more mountains, more close air support missions that blurred together in her memory. But some missions stood out. The ones where the math didn't work and the outcome seemed predetermined and she'd done it anyway. The rescue of the British patrol surrounded in the mountains. The medevac escort through a sandstorm that the meteorologists swore was worse than the one 8 years ago. The ground support mission where she'd stayed on station for 6 hours, well past her fuel endurance, rotating off to refuel from a tanker and coming right back because the troops below needed her. Each mission added to the legend. Each survival added to the mystique. The pilot who couldn't be stopped, who couldn't be killed, who showed up when hope was gone and made the impossible look routine. The enemy started avoiding areas where they knew she was operating. Psychological warfare at its purest. The threat of her presence was as effective as the actual violence she could deliver. Intelligence officers tracked the pattern, saw enemy forces changing their tactics, withdrawing from positions, refusing engagements when they knew Baba Yaga was airborne. They wrote papers about it, tried to quantify the effect. Couldn't. How do you measure the impact of one pilot's reputation? How do you calculate the lives saved because the enemy chose not to fight? The numbers existed, but they didn't capture the reality. The young pilots she'd trained were flying their own missions now, making their own legends, learning that technique got you most of the way but will cover the final distance. Some of them didn't make it, shot down or crashed or just unlucky in the way that combat aviation made people unlucky. She attended their memorials, stood in dress uniform while taps played and families cried, and felt the weight of all those missions where she'd survived and others hadn't. It wasn't survivors' guilt. It was survivors' knowledge that the difference between her and them was sometimes just luck, sometimes skill, sometimes the willingness to push past the point where pushing made sense. She couldn't save everyone, could only save the people in front of her when the moments arrived. The years accumulated. Volkov was 53, then 55, then 57. The mandatory retirement age for pilots loomed like a deadline she couldn't negotiate with. The Air Force offered her positions on staff, training command, desk jobs where her experience could shape policy and doctrine. She declined them all. She was a pilot. The cockpit was where she belonged. They let her keep flying, bending regulations because her record demanded it, because squadrons requested her specifically, because when the impossible missions came down, having Baba Yaga available wasn't just an asset, it was a strategic advantage. The A-10 she flew was older than some of her squadron mates. The airframe hours were astronomical. Maintenance costs were climbing. But it kept flying, kept fighting, kept bringing her home. The crew chief treated it like a relic now, something to be preserved as much as maintained. The aircraft had earned its place in history, had survived missions that should have destroyed it, had become as legendary as the pilot who flew it. The wooden plaque from Dagger Team stayed on her desk through every transfer, every change of station. 204 signatures, faded almost to illegibility now, the wood worn smooth from years of her hands running over it. Some of those seals had retired. Some had been killed in action in the years since. But the plaque remained, a connection to the moment when she'd done the thing that defined her career, when she'd looked at impossible mathematics and decided to fly anyway. New plaques joined it. Other units she'd supported, other lives she'd saved. They accumulated on her desk like a timeline of survival, each one representing a moment when death had seemed certain and she'd arrived anyway. She didn't display them for ego, kept them as reminders of why she did this, why she kept flying when her body said to quit, why she took the missions that made other pilots hesitate. Because somewhere there were people who needed someone to come when coming was impossible, and she decided a long time ago that she was that someone. At 58, the mandatory retirement finally caught up with her. No more waivers, no more extensions. The regulations were absolute. Her flying career was over. The final flight was scheduled for a Tuesday, deliberately low-key, no ceremony beyond what squadron tradition demanded. She didn't want fanfare, didn't want speeches. Just one last flight in the aircraft that had carried her through 2 decades of impossible missions. The squadron gathered to watch. Not just her current unit, but pilots from every squadron she'd served with, crew chiefs who'd maintained her aircraft, ground forces she'd supported. The ramp was crowded with people who'd come to witness the end of an era. Volkov walked to the A-10 in her flight suit, the worn patches and faded colors marking years of use. The crew chief was waiting by the aircraft, his eyes suspiciously bright. He'd maintained this warthog for 15 years, knew every rivet and repair, every scar on the titanium skin. He didn't say anything as she completed the pre-flight. Didn't need to. They'd said everything that mattered over the years, in hangars and flight lines and late nights when broken aircraft needed to be ready by dawn. She climbed into the cockpit for the last time. The seat fit like it always had, worn to the shape of her body by thousands of hours. The stick was familiar in her hand, the throttles positioned exactly where muscle memory expected them. She'd flown other aircraft before the A-10, would probably never fly anything after. But this was home. This cockpit. This machine. The engines spooled up with their familiar whine. She taxied to the runway, following procedures she could execute in her sleep, feeling the respond to her inputs with the reliability of long partnership. The tower cleared her for takeoff. She advanced the throttles and the Warthog accelerated down the runway, building speed until the moment of rotation, the instant where the aircraft left the ground and became something more than metal and fuel. Airborne. For the last time. She climbed into clear sky, the base falling away below, and felt the bittersweet ache of endings. This was the last time she'd feel this particular kind of freedom. The last time she'd push the stick forward and feel the A-10 respond. The last time she'd look at the world from the cockpit of the aircraft that had defined her career. She flew for an hour, making lazy circles over empty desert, saying goodbye to the life she'd lived. No guns, no targets, just flight for the sake of flight, the pure joy of being airborne that had drawn her to aviation in the first place. The A-10 flew perfectly, all systems nominal, as if it knew this was important. When the fuel gauge said it was time, she turned toward home. The landing was gentle. Wheels kissed the runway and the A-10 rolled to a stop with a grace that belied its brutal purpose. She shut down the engines for the last time and sat in the sudden silence, feeling the weight of endings settle around her shoulders. The canopy opened. The crew chief was there with the ladder, his face carefully neutral. She climbed down, her legs unsteady after an hour of flight, and placed her hand on the titanium fuselage one final time. Warm from the sun, scarred from 2 decades of combat. Still here. Still capable, just like her. The ceremony afterward was brief. The squadron commander said words about service and dedication. The base commander pinned on the final medal, another piece of ribbon to add to the collection. People applauded. Volkov stood at attention and accepted it all with the same discipline she'd brought to every mission. When it was over, she walked away from the flight line as a civilian. Her career ended not by enemy fire or aircraft failure, but by the simple mathematics of age and regulation. The transition to civilian life was harder than she'd expected. No more missions, no more briefs, no more climbing into the cockpit before dawn and pointing the aircraft toward danger. She tried to find purpose in other things: consulting work, mentoring young pilots, writing after-action reports that captured lessons learned. But nothing felt right. Nothing had the same weight as flying. The years passed quietly. Volkov aged in the way that pilots aged, scars becoming more prominent, old injuries making themselves known. She followed the news from the war zones, tracked the units she'd supported, felt a distant pride when missions succeeded and a distant ache when they failed. She wasn't there anymore, couldn't be there. But part of her would always be in those cockpits, flying through impossible weather toward certain danger. The call came on a Thursday, 15 years after her retirement. The base commander, a different one, younger than her by a decade, asking if she could come to the base for a ceremony. They were retiring the A-10 she'd flown, the aircraft that had become as legendary as the pilot who'd flown it. They wanted her there. She went. The aircraft sat on the ramp exactly as she remembered it, titanium skin bearing scars from 20 years of combat, the serial number she'd memorized long ago still visible on the tail. It looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile, but the crew chief, retired now himself, brought back for this occasion, assured her it could still fly, still had fight in it. But the Air Force had decided it was time. Time to retire the legends and make room for something new. The ceremony was everything the Air Force did well: formal, respectful, heavy with tradition. They read the aircraft's service history, the missions flown, the lives saved. The statistics were staggering: over 8,000 combat hours, 372 close air support missions, estimated 4,000 friendly forces supported. The numbers didn't capture reality, but they suggested it. Volkov stood at attention while they spoke, 73 years old now, still straight-backed, still carrying herself like the pilot she'd been. When they asked her to speak, she walked to the podium and looked at the assembled crowd: active-duty pilots, retired veterans, civilians who'd come to witness history. "This aircraft," she said, her voice still strong despite the years, "saved my life more times than I can count. And I used it to save lives I'll never meet. That's what we do. That's what military aviation is. We take these machines and we push them past their limits, and if we're lucky and skilled and stubborn enough, we come home. And we do it again, because somewhere there are people who need someone to come when coming is impossible." She paused, looking at the A-10 one last time. "This warthog flew through sandstorms and enemy fire and impossible odds. It brought me home when home seemed impossible. It earned its rest. We both did." The applause was genuine. When the ceremony ended, she walked to the aircraft one final time, placed her hand on the titanium skin, and felt the accumulated weight of 2 decades of missions, of survival, of doing the impossible because refusing wasn't an option. The A-10 would go to a museum, preserved as an example of what the aircraft could do, what pilots could accomplish, what happened when you refused to accept that something was impossible. Volkov went home to a quiet house in a quiet neighborhood, carrying memories that would never entirely fade. She'd been Baba Yaga, the thing that came when death was certain, the pilot who couldn't be killed, the woman who'd looked at 204 men about to die and decided to save them anyway. The legend was real. Built on titanium and determination and the refusal to quit. Built on a call sign that started as mockery and became respect. Built on mission after mission where the math said no and she said yes. The story should end there with the quiet dignity of retirement and remembrance. But legends don't really end. They transform. The young pilots who trained under her were squadron commanders now, passing down the lessons she'd taught. That technique gets you most of the way but will covers the final distance. That the aircraft will perform if you trust it. That impossible is just a word that means you haven't tried hard enough yet. When those pilots faced their own impossible missions, their own moments where the math didn't work and death seemed certain, they thought of Baba Yaga. Thought of the story about the sandstorm and the 204 SEALs who'd survived because one pilot had refused to accept the impossible. And they flew anyway, pushed past limits, brought their people home. The enemy still whispered about her in some regions, the legend growing beyond the reality, becoming mythology. The pilot who'd flown through storms that killed aircraft, who'd survived fire that destroyed everything else, who'd come from nowhere when hope was dead and changed the outcome. The stories weren't all accurate, some were embellished, but the core truth remained. Nadia Volkov had been real, had done things that seemed impossible, had saved lives that should have been lost. That was enough, more than enough. In a quiet house in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by medals and plaques and memories, a 73-year-old woman sat and remembered what it felt like to fly, to push the stick forward and feel an A-10 Thunderbolt respond, to see the world from the cockpit where impossible things became routine, to be Baba Yaga, the witch, the legend, the pilot who came when death was certain and made survival possible. The story was over, but the legend would last as long as pilots flew and soldiers fought, and someone needed to believe that impossible was just another word for not yet done.